Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Our text for today is one that in some ways we're very familiar with. It's a text about starting over. It is the story of a new life. The ancient Israelites are in transition from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. And this text is about how do you go about learning to live as free people who are no longer in bondage to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. What exactly will this new life look like? How do you learn how to live a new life? Change is never easy, is it? It's almost always hard, and it's often not something that we want. And we can see here, too, that the ancient Israelites really also struggled with change, didn't they? Here they are talking about looking back wistfully towards the good old days when they were living in slavery. If anybody has ever heard that expression, longing for the flesh pots of Egypt, have you ever heard that term? Yeah, that's from this text. This translation is a little bit different. It calls pots of meat, which is not quite as cool as flesh pots. But, of course, in modern English, flesh does not generally mean meat anymore either. But today we will be learning about what does it mean to be living a new life. So let me start out first by talking about the story that we have been going through so far. The Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt, and they were under terrible bondage. But they cried out for help, and God heard their cries. And so God sends Moses to lead the people to confront Pharaoh and to bring them out of Egypt. And that's what we heard about last week with the burning bush story. Well, what's happened since last week is that God has sent terrible plagues on Egypt to force Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Finally, after many, many plagues, Pharaoh relents after the last and most terrible of them. And the ancient Israelites celebrate Passover to commemorate their deliverance from Egypt. But as the people flee, then suddenly Pharaoh has a change of heart. He decides to go after them. He sends his great army after them to bring them back by force. And it is this time that God enters the fray. And God defeats Pharaoh and Pharaoh's army at the Sea of Reeds in a great victory that is commemorated in song in Exodus. But now the people are wandering in the wilderness. This is what you would call a liminal time. Liminal comes from the word for threshold because it is a time between times. They are living in that in-between slavery on the one hand and life of freedom in the Promised Land. Living liminally is probably something we can also understand, can't we? After all, we are now living in an age after the great heyday of mainline churches and moving into a new future that we don't really know what it looks like. So in many ways, we too are like the ancient Israelites wandering in the wilderness. They have to learn how to be free people. Today's reading begins with hunger in the wilderness because the people are free from slavery and God has defeated Pharaoh, but now they are in the middle of nowhere. They might have all of that gold and jewels that they were able to take from the Egyptians, but you know what? It doesn't really do any good if there's no food around, does it? Kind of reminds me of that story from the book of Heidi where Heidi, so excited, she picks some strawberries and she goes into town and she sells them for some money, and she comes back and says, "Grandfather, grandfather, look at what I have brought you, some money." And he says, "Well, try eating that." Money doesn't do much good if there's nothing to buy with it. And that's the problem. They are in the middle of the wilderness and there is no food to be found anywhere. And they complain. They complain to Moses, they complain to Aaron, probably complain to whoever would listen. Now, they're a bit melodramatic in their complaints. After all, they say, "It would have been better to die in Egypt, where at least we had bread and meat to eat." Well, that's kind of dramatic. But at the base, you can understand their concern, right? Now, for us, we have traditionally kind of criticized them when we have read this text. And in fact, I think that if Terry had read this text, she probably would even put a little whiny voice in when they were talking about, not having food and being hungry. Because that's kind of how we hear it, isn't it? We hear this sort of whiny voice when they say that. I mean, after all, look at all that God has done for them. And yet here they are whining like spoiled little babies. But then if you think about it a little bit more, you realize that these are not little kids who have all their needs met. These are grown-ups, parents with children to feed, who do not have any food. So these aren't sullen teenagers complaining about mom's cooking and desiring McDonald's instead. No, these are really people without food who are hungry and are worried about starving to death because they're in the middle of the wilderness and they don't know where they are and they don't know how long they're going to be there. They're scared, they're afraid. And you know what? It seems that at least at this part of the story, God acknowledges the legitimacy of their complaints because notice, God does not criticize them. Later, God will criticize them for their complaining. But at this point, God is not criticizing them. In fact, God implicitly accepts their criticism, which kind of reminds me of being freed from Egypt, right? Remember, what was it that signaled to God that God needed to save the people? God heard their cries. So once again, God hears their cries and responds. And God not only doesn't criticize them for what they have done, but God provides for them what they need to survive, and then some. Bread will rain down upon them every morning, and the people will have their fill of bread. Now, it doesn't quite look like what they expect. They ask each other, "What is it?" Which, by the way, what is it in Hebrew is manna. So actually, whenever you see the word manna, it's a little bit of a pun, a little joke here. What is it? Oh, it's manna. What is it? It's manna. It's like who's on first, right? What is it? That's what manna means in Hebrew. But you know what? Not only will bread rain down on them every morning, quail will fly into their camp every night. And the people will have meat to eat every day. Now that's something we take for granted, right? Having meat to eat every day. But in the ancient world, that wasn't really a thing. At least not for the ordinary person. Meat was a rarity. It was expensive. And so it was generally something you reserved for festive occasions. But here they are in the middle of the desert with all the bread they can eat and meat to eat every day. God has very graciously responded to their call, and God has generously provided for their needs. And at the same time, God has also kind of provided them with what you could call an economics lesson here, right? Because part of this is about learning how to be free people. Notice that they can collect as much or as little as they want. Now, do the ones who collected a bunch end up with a lot left over? No. Did those who didn't collect very much go hungry? No. This is an interesting story, isn't it? Because no matter how much you collected or how little you collected, at the end of the day, you still had exactly what you needed. You had an omer per person. An omer, I guess, is about 2 quarts or so. So, yeah. Miraculously, everyone is provided for exactly what they need. Notice that here, greed is not compatible with trust. And not only that, having enough is not dependent upon your efforts. Having enough is entirely the result of the grace of God, the free, unmerited gift. Now see, under Pharaoh, you had to earn your keep. Under Pharaoh, work determined whether or not you could eat. But under God, in the wilderness, grace is the rule. You eat because it's a gift. Walter Brueggemann, the theologian of the Old Testament, talks about the myth of scarcity under Pharaoh and how it forces us to be constantly guarding what we have because we're afraid that we might lose the scarce resources that we have. Versus what the God of the wilderness is teaching us, and that is a lyric of abundance. This recognition that we live in an abundant world where there is more than enough for all, which, by the way, there is. This planet produces more than enough food for every man, woman, and child on this planet. It's just a matter of getting it where it needs to go. But it's there. And that, I think, is where we see the message for us today. Because even though we don't live like slaves, although as much time some of us spend working, you might be surprised to find out that they aren't slaves, but we do know what it's like to live in a world where work determines your worth. When 2 men meet each other for the first time, what is one of the first questions they ask of each other? Well, what do you do? And the implication, of course, is what do you do for money, right? What's your job? You don't usually answer and say, oh, I'm a father, or I'm a brother, I have 2 brothers, or I'm a nephew. You don't say any of that. You say, well, I'm a doctor. Of course, you're lying. You're actually not. You're a day laborer. But you want to be impressive, so you tell me you're a doctor. So we know what it's like to live in a world like Pharaoh's, where work determines your worth. We know what it's like to live in a world where the deserving get to eat and the undeserving do not. Now, I notice those words deserving and undeserving get thrown around a lot. Politicians love to use those words. You'll hear them talking about, well, we can only give help to those who deserve it. We don't want to give it to undeserving people. The question that they never seem to ask out loud, which I want to ask, is who gets to decide who is and is not deserving? That's the real question here then. Okay, so if you're going to divide people into deserving and undeserving, who gets to be the arbitrator of that? Strangely enough, I think it's often the person using those words, which strikes me as troubling at the very least. Because who gets to decide who's deserving and isn't? That's real power here. Notice God does not make that determination here. God merely makes sure that all the people have the food that they need to survive. So although we aren't slaves, we know what it's like to fear. We know what it's like to hoard. We know what it's like to feel scarcity. Even though we are living pretty comfortably here in the U.S., we still feel like there's a fear that we could lose. This fear that we wouldn't have enough. And that is the way of Pharaoh. But what God is calling us to do is to embrace abundance. Just like the ancient Israelites, we need to realize that it is God that provides. It's not our labor that provides. It's not our virtue that provides. It is God's pure, unmerited goodness, God's grace. God has provided, God does provide, and God will provide. Life and what it takes to sustain life is a gift from God. It's kind of a kooky thing about our world is that we put dollar amounts on everything. How much is it worth to live another day? Can you really put a dollar amount on that? I mean, our system does it all the time, doesn't it? Insurance agents with their tables will tell you exactly how much a person is worth in terms of paying out their life insurance. But we know in the real world, in God's world, there is no price that you can put on life. So what could we even do to deserve it? What great good work could actually ever deserve that incredibly, infinitely valuable thing, life? It is not dependent on whether or not we are deserving, whatever that means. By embracing abundance, we can learn to see ourselves as recipients of God's grace. We don't see ourselves as some sort of great, strong, and powerful person that has achieved all of these things and earned all these things and deserves all these things. Rather, we see ourselves for what we are, fragile, flawed human beings who are beloved children of God and are recipients of God's goodness. And in exchange for that realization, our hearts can be filled with gratitude. We can look at the world with grateful eyes. And then comes our response. Because you see, we have security from knowing that God will provide. That is a safety net, the ultimate safety net that guards us and protects us. And we have gratitude for what God has provided. And we realize that we no longer have to try to determine who is and isn't worthy. And out of that gratitude, out of that realization that there are, in God's economy, no worthy and unworthy, we can then turn around and provide for others. We can feed the hungry. We can care for the needy. We can give. So you see how that works. God provides for us, which allows us to have an epiphany, to recognize our utter dependence on God and our gratitude for what God has done for us. And then we can turn around and give to others. I believe I've been using a phrase for this a few times before. You may have heard it. Blessed to be a blessing. That's what we're talking about here. That is what the people wandering in the wilderness needed to learn. Because you know what? When you're slaves, it's hard to be generous. It's hard to care for your neighbor. Instead, you have a system that encourages you to be suspicious and to be stingy and to hoard. And in fact, that is what Pharaoh was. Suspicious, hoarding people don't gang up against the rulers. But once we recognize our dependence on God, we can turn it around and become givers ourselves. God had to train the Israelites how to be free, and that in so much as what is going on in the wilderness. They are being trained for how to be free. It's a little counterintuitive in a way, because the learning to be free and to be self-sufficient, the first lesson that they need to learn is to be utterly dependent on God. That is not exactly the way we would think about that, is it? The first way to learn to be free and independent and self-determining is to be utterly dependent on God. And yet that is exactly the lesson that this text is telling us today. But you know what? When we think about that closely, we realize that's not actually that strange of a message. Because how does a child learn to become a free grown-up? They learn it from being utterly dependent on their parents. That baby needs to be completely dependent upon its parents so that it can grow into adulthood. Likewise, the Israelites needed to be dependent upon God to grow into the free nation that God wanted them to be, the blessed to be a blessing. So we remember our dependence on God. We remember the gratitude that we feel, and that frees us to give to others. Amen.